So hi, Jamie McCusker. This is the TWed talks. I'm giving the talk and introducing myself because John Erickson can't make it today. Today I'm going to be talking about the problem with continuous and discrete representations in knowledge representation and what the heck we can do about it. So it's called Splitting the World with My Grandfather's Axe. For those of you who are familiar with the grandfather's axe problem, good for you. I'll talk about it in a bit. Basically, yeah, we're going to be getting a little bit into a little bit of practical philosophy, such as it exists, and really talk about kind of why that affects our work with knowledge graphs and knowledge representation and semantics. So I'm going to start by talking about the idea of entities. So when we have a knowledge graph, right, we have a node, we have another node, and we might connect it with a thing, a link. And so that's great. And we can do so much with this. It's really cool. One of the reasons why this works is because we say that this node actually represents a thing, an entity, an object, or an event, or whatever, but it's something. And that something is distinct from the rest of the universe, right? We say that it's, there's a bunch of stuff that is this thing. The rest of it is not, it's something else. Now, when we're working with graphs, that's really helpful because we can literally draw a circle around the thing that we mean when we're working with entities. And so this actually comes from the world of symbolic logic, where we talk about we have variables like p, therefore q, p, q, right? So that is when we're working with symbols. These symbols, when we talk about graphs, actually relate to the specific thing here, right? So we can say that this is, we can pretend that a node is P and another node is Q, and so these are symbols that we're talking about that relate to specific things. If we say, this really sounds very basic, but there's a reason why I'm going into this. The idea of entities kind of comes from our use of entities in knowledge graphs comes from symbolic logic, comes from knowledge representation. It comes from the tradition of treating things as distinct and unique. Now, in philosophy, that's actually one of the very first things that happens with that. And by very first things, I mean literally it was discussed in ancient Greece, was this idea that got the pizzas here.
I need someone else.
Hi, we'll have some of that in a second. Thank you, but water. Okay. We can cut that part out. Okay, so.
What you want.
Yes. And actually, you know what? I should use pizza as an example because we're going to have pizza. Well, no, actually it's going to be the impossibility of a pizza ontology.
Possibilities?
Oh, yes. Of an accurate pizza ontology. Or at least instances around the pizza instantiating things in the pizza ontology. And so the classic example is that, and by classic, I mean classic antiquity, it's called the Ship of Theseus. And so there was a ship that Theseus set sail from Athens to Crete, but the Minotaur seduced Ariadne, broke up with her on the way home, and came back home in the same ship. And actually, the legend is that they actually had black sails on the ship, and his father killed himself out of grief because he was supposed to switch over to white sails if he survived. He forgot somehow. I don't know what the deal was exactly. And one of the interesting things about the Ship of Theseus was that, so first off, this legend comes from very early in Greek history. Basically, Athens was one of the first Greek cities, period. And the legend actually comes from potentially very early in that history, in the Bronze Age. The ship supposedly, reportedly, survived until classical antiquity. So Plato, Aristotle, Socrates potentially saw this ship in the harbor. It was docked at the port in Athens for a very long time. Now we're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So, the cloth sails eventually rot, and maybe it was kind of embarrassing that they had they still had the black flags on, or black sails on, so they replaced them with the white sails, or maybe they kept the black ones, who knows. But they were new sails. But then suddenly the termites got into the mast, so they had to replace the mast. And then there were a couple of boards that were, we only have black markers. A couple of boards started to fall off and they were rotting, so they need to be replaced. More and more and more and more. And, most philosophers in ancient Greece were fairly practical. They knew what was happening to the ship, and they saw people having to repair it on a regular basis. And you see this, there are old ships even now that go into dry dock and get massive overhauls. And they still get called the same ship, and this was still the same Ship of Theseus. One thing they realized is that there's no way this entire ship, even any piece of this ship, was original to what was built originally that carried Theseus. Eventually, every single piece of the ship replaced, one by one, a little bit at a time. And at this point, are we talking about the same ship? And this is the problem of the Ship of Theseus. Is the Ship of Theseus the same ship in classical antiquity as it was when it set sail to Crete? Are you, and this is kind of where this comes from, are you physically, well, so you're not physically, are you the same person you were when you were born? You have a different physical composition. You're much bigger, I hope. You are, your brains have developed, you've gained capabilities, you've gained memories, and literally all the matter in you has been replaced a number of times. So what is it that makes you you? This is called the problem of personal identity and is another paradox of philosophy. And it's not one we're going to solve today because it's just not going to happen. But the thing is that it's the same question, right? So physical continuity is the same sort of thing. If I gradually replace all the matter in me, I still feel like me, but I'm not physically the same entity that I started out as. And actually there's an example that's in the Buddhist tradition of someone who has his arm like chopped off and replaced, then his other arm, and then his legs, and basically gradually like every single part of him was replaced, but he never felt different. It's meant to be a metaphor for this idea of, change over time that can happen. And at what point are you a different person? Or are you? Now, the other idea, it's kind of a more modern version of that, is something along the lines of imagine every minute one of your neurons was replaced. Maybe with an exact duplicate, maybe with an artificial one that works exactly the same. You don't notice this because it's magic or teleportation or whatever you want to call it. But your brain is being basically copied one by one, and it's seamless and you don't notice. And at what point, how many neurons in do you have to go before you're not the same person anymore? How many neurons, you take those same neurons that you pulled out and put them back together and put them in a new body. Is this you before? Or is it a new person? Similarly, there's the question of teleportation. So Star Trek, they go in transporters all the time, and they disassemble every atom from you, and they beam it across not the galaxy usually, but they beam it down to the planet, and they reassemble you in one piece again. And so that you've got you that's up on the transporter pad, and then there's you down on the planet, right? And so they send it over, and well, first off, what do they do with this person here? They go away, right? And so, in theory, you're here. What do they have? They have like all the atoms and their positions and whatever else they needed, and with the Heisenberg compensators and all that sort of stuff that's happening. They're basically rebuilding a copy of you down here, right? And interesting detail in Star Trek, the food replicators use the same technology as transporters. They actually rebuild food from scratch as it was put together by some chef originally. And they can make multiple copies of that food. If they sent you down to that planet and you died down there, oh, well, you can make another. And so we send down another person, pick up where they left off. Same person? Different person? Why did they destroy this guy? Is this one dead? What's going on here? These are all aspects of the problem of personal identity, where you are potentially, drawing that line between you and not you becomes very difficult. So there's a lot of potential solutions to it, one of which we talked about physical continuity. So like, I'm still me because I've continued to be me, and you can kind of draw a circle around me and say, this is me. But there are a lot of issues that we just talked about. Physical, there's the idea of, so they call it processual continuity, like a process that continues. But again, with teleportation, are they the same person? They feel like they're the same person. That would argue that they're not necessarily. Just continuity is another popular one. The continuity of consciousness. Of course, there's I've got a conscious state in my head that is continually creating experience. If you cut that off, if there's a disconnect between that, then there's then it's a different person. because that's, the different conscious experiences. But there's this thing called going to sleep, where you're not conscious. So is that discontinuity creating a new person every night? And then there's memories, which of course can be copied, again, in the case of the transporter, but you can also copy them other ways. And then, so this sounds really theoretical, right? Like who cares about this? Except that whenever we talk about a biological system, you get the same problem. So, or actually, most natural systems is not just biological systems. But so let's say we have a clump of cells, right? And they are clones of each other, and this is actually called a cell line, where they're all like exactly the same. But you can also, you can split the cell line half. You used to have one colony, now you have two colonies. But they're still the same cells that they were before. If you take a rock, split it in half, it's still the same matter. Is it the same rock? What if you glue it back together? What if you repair it? If I take a cup, smash it, glue it back together, is it the same cup? Why is that different than a tree or a rock? Rivers will change their course over time, sometimes radically. Are they the same river? A different river? Then there's things like identical twins, which is actually even more practical than this. We have two cells in a zygote, split in half. Now suddenly we have two people instead of one person. We didn't have the entities that this wasn't it. Before it split, we don't know exactly why they split. Before it split, that was one entity. We would think of it as one entity. And now we're thinking about two entities for some reason. When we have, so fungi, mushrooms, and that's just ridiculous there, because the underground network, the fungal underground networks in most forests are massive and really convoluted, and we have no idea how they interact. And it's like a multi-species thing, and sometimes it's kind of the same thing, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it acts as like a forest-wide network. You can actually transport nutrients from tree to tree. That's actually one reason why when you get mushrooms on old logs is they're actually pulling all the nutrients out and drawing it into the other trees in the forest. The distinction between the individual the individual trees and the fungi that support them and the forest as a whole is really hard to figure out. It's a continuous process that we really, really want to make discrete somehow. Because you look at a tree and you see a tree, right? You might want to even identify the tree and say, oh yeah, there's this tree in the knowledge graph and it's next to this other tree. But then later on we realize, oh wait, this is an alder. And is the alders or aspens? They actually they're all one big tree underground. They have an interconnected root system. It's not it's not hundreds of trees for acres and acres. It's just one tree. And so when we're dealing with biological systems, we're dealing with natural systems, this gets harder and harder and harder every time we try to represent it. And so the further down you go in reality, the more continuous everything gets, right? Until things get really discrete. So there's matter, And it has, if we look at, the level of physics, there really aren't, entities don't really exist, right? We're just collect lumps of matter and that happen to interact in interesting ways, and we're able to put an interpretation on top of that. And that's actually one thing that is like going back to Buddhism. One reason why there's that story about the man who fell apart, I guess you can call him, is that this distinction between one person and another, or one person and the rest of the universe, is completely arbitrary and actually kind of illusory. And there's psychology behind it to back it up. There's neuroscience to back it up, and the basic physics back this up, that there is no real, it's really hard to draw a distinction between you and the rest of the universe, or between any one entity and the rest of the universe. So these little circles that we draw are useful abstractions. But as some people like to say, all models are wrong. Some models are useful.
George Box.
Hmm?
George Box said that. Yeah.
And so when you're building out these models, you have to think about this idea of identity kind of from the beginning. Now, before I go into kind of like the future stuff, I do want to talk a little bit about how we've dealt with this in the past. In the I've spent a lot of time talking about entity, but not as much time as the provenance working group spent talking about entity.
No one could.
No, I don't have that much time. Basically, it was a room about the size of this gathering in terms of people, probably more, of people who've been thinking about provenance for quite a long time. And the aggregate experience in provenance research was probably in the hundreds of years in this room. They spent 2 days talking about what is an entity, basically, and how we should represent it, and what it should be, and what it should mean. And ultimately, we came up with an entity as an entity. We didn't even call it an entity at first, we called it Bob. And so Bob could have been a description of an entity, it could have been a representation of the entity itself, it could be the entity itself, and the URI is the identifier for the entity. And so kind of like, it was like trying to rehash the whole, there's the semiotic triangle of, there's the symbol, there's the referent, there's the thought. Right, and so, the link between the symbol and the referent is mediated by the thought, because there's no direct link between a symbol.
PS.
Yes. Between a symbol and the thing that it represents in the world. The only way to do that is to mediate it through some sort of thinking machine, and brains in this case. And so the question was, what is this thing that we're trying to work with? And where does it sit in this world? Because you can also stack these up, right? You can have a concept. So let's say it's a concept instead of a thought. But sorry, I'm trying to look at this right. So let's say it's actually a concept. The concept itself is actually something that happens in our heads, and there's a symbol associated with that. Even it's actually there's something we can there's something that exists that is actually also a referent, right? And the actual thing could be weighed at this level. You might have a thought about a concept, and you'd have a symbol for the concept, but the concept isn't actually the thing itself. It's actually the idea of the referent.
Pricing, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so you can drive yourself nuts with this, and we almost did. But kind of ultimately we settled that the entity itself is this guy, the actual, the URI for that entity, the identifier for that entity is this symbol here. And we weren't working with concepts. It wasn't like just identifying descriptions, we were identifying things. And so we kind of made this as direct as possible. Now, the problem that we have when we start thinking about this is identifying ships of Theseus. And this is literally what I brought to the meeting. Like, how do we handle this issue? And it wasn't the ship itself that we cared about. It was the fact that there's all of these variations, like the idea that you have, go back to the, you have a ship, but then you also have versions of the ship. You need to be able to, how do you distinguish between the ship as seen by Aristotle in 500 BC versus the ship that set sail to Crete in 1000 BC? Right, they're not the same ship. And we want to be able to distinguish between them because they are literally materially different. And so what we did was we basically said, well, we know that this is, this whole thing happens, and we're going to deal with that by making more entities. And so what we do, we came up with a new, not actually that new, we generalized the idea of, so there's this thing, co-reference relation. When you have two entities, let's say we have two, actually no, let's go back to the, we've got we've got the actual, and it's kind of hilarious because I'm using a symbol to create the referent. But we have, we might have one thought, and then we have a symbol. But then we can have another symbol that points to a thought that refers to the referent, right? So this is the non-unique naming assumption, the idea that you can have more than one name for a thing. Far be it from me to speak against that particular assumption, because lots of things have multiple names, and in the semantic web, you can have multiple URIs that identify the same thing. Now, the idea with this is that you would have these symbols, and so let's go back to circles here. You would have two symbols that are different nodes in the graph, but then you say same as, right? So basically, this guy is the same as this guy. Great, we solved the problem, except, no, that's not even the problem. It's good that there's two, but now everything that's true about this guy is also true about this guy and reversed. So every fact in symbol A, symbol B are now shared. They're indistinguishable because they're identical. And that's Leibnizian identity and is great and really useful. And when we're doing kind of data integration, when we know what we're doing with it, it is very helpful to kind of pull things together. And actually, a lot of RDF databases now support something called smushing, which is that when they see this same as, what it does is basically in the back end of the database, it treats it as one entity. It just says, the statements in here, it's going to merge them. So we're going to basically have a database record with multiple URIs attached to it. So we don't even have to think about it. It's just going to copy everything over automatically because there's no copying to do. Which is very handy when what you're talking about is indistinguishable and identical.
It reminds me of the concept of dependence origination. Like there's a concept in philosophy, and it's like this costs this thing, but it's the same as it is, but it's we'll take it offline and
Yeah,
it's a concept. You probably have seen it.
yeah, probably.
Can I comment something about the smushing? So as somebody who implemented the, like the tabulator, if you're familiar with Tim's tabulator, so smushing actually doesn't work all the time, like because, these two concepts, even though they have a same as relationship, the properties are different. And sometimes the properties would, contradict.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We're going to talk about that, yeah.
Well, I mean, so there's, that's actually a really interesting point because there are cases where you might, you might have contradictory facts about something because those facts might be contextual, or even just like within the, I imagine you saw something that was even more practical than that.
Yeah, like Tim has like two of RDF files and they have contradictory facts, like, and both were created by himself.
Right.
And yeah,
About himself.
about himself.
And he contradicted himself.
Contradicts himself,
Well, he contains multitudes.
right?
And that's actually that's actually interesting. So that's an interesting segue because this, so yeah, the same as is tricky for a number of reasons, some of them technical, some of them representational, where you are actually thinking about maybe a slightly different twist on the same entity. And so, and this is the classic co-reference relation where if you think you can treat them the same. But what if they're identical, what if they're distinguishable but identical? What if these things actually have some sort of distinction between them? And so if we have these two ships of Theseus, go back to this, one of them is physically different materials, different piece, and so the provenance would be very different for it. And the actual, if we say the composition, if we had like instruments about composition or mass or anything else, those would all be very different. And we had all those sorts of measurements. But the thing is that, there are some cases where we want to talk about the fact that this is the same thing. There are cases where we want to distinguish between them, and there are cases where we want to kind of not distinguish between them. And so what we would do is actually make what I would call an abstracted or decontextualized entity for this. So there is kind of across all possible interpretations of the Ship of Theseus, there's a much more conceptual version of it. That doesn't rely on any one particular piece of matter being in a particular place, or cares about a particular composition or mass, and we can't actually say any of those things about it in principle. But it is essentially a way to talk about the relationship between these things. And so what we do in the provenance, the prov ontology is that we talk about these kind of more concrete representations being specializations of this more abstract one. In other ontologies, they use the term concretizes. Neither are very good in terms of terminology. It requires a lot of explanation, and I'm probably the most frequent user of specialization of in prov at this point, just because it's hard to understand and can be tricky to get right. But it solves this problem that you have two very different things that are actually the same thing. And so that's how we deal with that issue in prov specifically. Now, what this means is that every time you want to record something and you have a distinction to make, you have to create a new URI, and you have to basically, add another entity to the graph. And we have to know how to interpret it, and it can get weird, and it's not a perfect solution. So that's kind of where we stand. But that's where we stand right now. One thing that I want to talk about is I want to kind of flip this around for a second, because there's another side to this. There's a reason why we like to think about these entities. Why are entities so appealing to us? And it's actually a deep evolutionary trait that we developed because it's useful to think of the world in terms of objects. This goes back to the first perceiving organisms that were able to kind of observe the world. Object detection is literally burned into our retinas and into our brains. We have whole sections built for object detection and distinction. Our language is built on discrete pieces and turns continuous flows, like literally continuous flows of sound waves into chunks. And it does it without us having to think about it. And so this entity bias, as I've been thinking of it, is fundamental to how we think as humans. It's fundamental to how any animals think as animals. I went looking and I couldn't find a counterexample actually of if it has a nervous system, it seems to be thinking in terms of, if there's any perception, it will chunk that into entities, or there's not simply doing enough with its nervous system to be able to do anything like that. But one of the issues there, of course, is that, as we said, that it has edge cases, right? That it's not a perfect model of the universe. It is not in some ways, it's a misleading model of the universe and can cause lots of trouble sometimes if you really assume that distinction goes all the way down to the bottom. And so what you end up with is this divide between kind of like our brains wanting to create a chunky universe and a universe that's like, maybe, I don't know, sometimes. The interesting thing is that when you flip that around a lot, and you look at artificial neural nets, they're not chunky, they're not lumpy, they're not entity focused. They work in continuity. And it could be that in many ways that's advantageous for working with like if we're doing like some sort of like analysis of a continuous stream, it can actually do a prediction of another continuous stream from that, and that's great. But if we're trying to have it work with human style intelligence, it's not that chunkiness is a barrier. The lack of chunkiness is a barrier to how humans think and trying to replicate kind of the advances that we've made. And so my argument is that if we have if we move forward with neural AI, it's going to be through introducing the bias that's thrown us off all these years, all these millennia, and helping it try to understand the universe in terms of entities. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have. I'm curious about everyone's perspectives on this so far and how much crap I'm full of.
I'll start. I guess I have heard this before, so I'm cheating a little bit. I had time to think about it. But great talk. Thank you. And what I'm wondering about is, so it's true that we do tend to chunk things. We tend to think in abstractions and symbolic representations, but we do so in a very fuzzy way, right? Compared to the way that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
We change and kind of modify our concepts over time. They're not entirely consistent. We'll just kind of make things up and make up why it should
Right, yeah.
that way and so on. Which is maybe a better way for understanding the world, which isn't actually conceptual.
Exactly.
But so I guess how does that kind of worldview? So it's not just chunkiness, it's kind of fuzziness. Do you kind of feel like that has a role there, or?
Well, so that's why I was distinguishing between like chunkiness and lumpiness and discrete systems. And so like a knowledge graph is discrete, it's like sand. But if you look at, if you look at human cognition, the idea of these entities they're not fixed like that. They're not like, I can think about my arm, and it can be part of me, but the seam is pretty smooth and there's no real like literal cutoff point where I can say this is my arm and this isn't. And so when you have a discrete system, you're talking about discontinuity between one thing and another. And even having that sort of chunky or lumpy representation that's able to handle the idea of entities, but also handle the idea that, well, mostly, right? That's actually that's radically different from the symbolic systems that we work with when we're actually doing things like knowledge graphs. And so that's going to, in my mind, that's actually going to be one of the things that we need to figure out is like, how do we make knowledge graphs more continuous, and how do we make neural systems more lumpy? And maybe we can get them to meet in the middle, but not necessarily like having these two extremes isn't really doesn't help either of them, and it actually keeps them from being integrated. But the history there is like, it went through language is more discrete, and then we came up with logic, which kind of tried to formalize it and made it more discrete still. And then kind of like the further we went down that path, the more everything crystallized as like these discrete entities, to the point where if we give a knowledge graph, if we say to the knowledge graph, the world's continuous, it literally wouldn't mean anything to the knowledge graph. You couldn't explain that to it because it would represent it as discrete entities and not actually be able to tell you anything about the fact that it's continuous. There's no way it could like, you can't even, you can express the fact that, world has type continuous. But that's not going to, that's still two discrete nodes in a graph connected by a link. That's not actually expressing the continuity that actually exists. Anyone else?
I was just looking at an email from Hugh Glasser about same as dot.
Oh, okay.
He was asking if he should let it die. Cannot maintain it apparently.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, it's funny because like one of the first things so when I was first year, I actually submitted an abstract for a talk that was called "Same as Considered Harmful to Provenance," and that got that got some buzz around it and ultimately we ended up doing. There were a couple papers later, and then we did some stuff with Harry Hoppin and Pat Hayes.
Which one? The 10-year?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that, you know, making trouble like this paid off at least, but we've never said same as is bad. It's that it has its place, and we need to be very careful, but we need to be very careful how we're using it. And so, yeah, I mean, if I'd feel sad if sameas.org went away. I'd have money for it.
Available. They will let the service die because there's a cost to running it, but yeah, they'll make the data set available.
That's good. Yeah, because I mean, I think that's the main value there is being able to do that and then maybe extending it as time goes on.
Yeah.
The historical artifact.
So maybe I have a question on like computational provenance. So I know you talked about representing provenance entity and whatnot. Now I work in blockchain, so there's a way of like, you know, preserving provenance in a more computable way. So do you have any thoughts about that? Like how
Do I have thoughts about blockchain-based provenance?
provenance? Yes.
Yes, I do. Do. I don't know if I can, that would be a much more cranky talk, I think. I mean, so what you would actually represent as the provenance in the blockchain would still have to have some sort of representation to it. And so you would still need to you stuff has something, right? Knowledge graph fragment or something. But the relationship like this between things and between different versions of the same thing could run afoul of the same issues, depending on how you're doing it. So I mean, I see those as worth.
My point of view is like, you know, in the representation in a world, yes, like anybody can assert like, you know, okay, I'm the one to create this particular knowledge asset. I have the first claim, right?
Right.
But there's no way to prove it, right? So wouldn't the provenance break apart like at that point? Because the whole point of having provenance is to, you know, kind of assert that, you know, somebody has, like, this is how something was derived, right?
Right. Well, so that's actually an interesting thing. So when I did my my dissertation for the digital signature framework, it was very heavily provenance driven. I hadn't heard a damn thing about blockchain at that point, but it was a large part of it was actually about creating hashes of hashes. So it is a very similar structure to blockchain, just not. And so what we did was essentially you sign an abstract hash of a graph, not the serialization of a graph, but the actual graph content itself. And so you wouldn't like lay claim to it. You're basically, you're not laying claim to it, you're claiming it, right? So it's not like claiming it like, you know, like a homesteader would claim a plot of land. it's claiming it like you're asserting it, you're saying this thing is true. And that's about as far, that's kind of all I hoped for from that. I wasn't saying that this is the, that this is the actual, we can like prove that this went this way. You can't prove that, there's some, I guess, so if you make, if you show how someone used something to create another piece of knowledge and you can, and they assert that it's the case, then maybe you get someone else who believes it for some reason, they can kind of co-sign that assertion that they generated that thing. But again, it goes back to, it's the web of trust, right? At some point, at some point there is no, and I saw this with digital signatures and the idea of signatures as a whole, there is no like zero trust way to implement that. You either, with a conventional signature, like the legal principle behind a signature is that if I sign a document, I can always claim that I didn't sign it, that I can repudiate my own signature. But the thing is that I would have to do it under oath in a court of law, which would put me in jeopardy for perjury. And so that's what's holding the legal, the contract system together right now, is that consequence and nothing else. There is no like, you must do this thing because it says so, it says you do it in the contract that you signed. You can just break the contract, right? You can just say, okay, I'm out. And there might be consequences for that, but that has to be laid out in the contract. And so, that's all, the idea of proving something mathematically that's never really been intended to be proved in terms of trust, that's still hard. And I'm not sure blockchain help, I don't yet see, and it could be that someone's figured it out, I don't yet see how that circumvents that process that I talked about, that legal process. Because ultimately, if you have it's one thing to get a computer to do it for you, it's another thing to make a human do it because they put it on the blockchain.
Yeah, I think you have two things, like signatures and also provenance. So I guess you're right. Like, if somebody puts a gun to my head, like, yeah, I'm like, if it's like I have some ownership of a certain asset, but yeah, I will give the asset to somebody, even though the ownership is there.
Right, yeah.
Blockchain. So I agree with that. Like, the legal system has to kind of work hand in hand. But my question was more on the representation side. So I personally believe that, just representing provenance in an ontology is never going to work. Like, I think that's why the adoption of the provenance ontology is very, very abysmal.
So I guess that's the question is, what do you mean by it's never going to work? To what use case? Because the idea of, there are a lot of things that work really well on the honor system.
Mhm.
And it works if you have a way of at least validating that it's the person that you trust, instead of, like, if you don't trust them at all, then there's all sorts of problems that crop up no matter what.
Right.
And so I guess that was my point, is that at some point you have to trust someone or something. And the blockchain is a tighter way of verifying that it's the person that you trust.
Yes.
You don't have to trust them as much, or can have, they can, you can find someone that you do trust that will validate it for you. But that's not the same thing as like trusting going in without trusting anything or anyone. and just having it be mathematically provable.
Well, but it's like honor system is like an ideal in an ideal case, it would work. But I think like blockchain, because you don't, the whole system assumes that everyone is malicious. It's trustless, so it provides that ideal system in which provenance and
Except that,
work in.
except that the honor system has worked,
Okay, yeah, but not in all cases, really. That's
right?
just
Um,
hard to be like universal.
right, but I guess my point is that if you say that, so a trustless system, as you're talking about it, is, well, so first off, you still have to trust the blockchain itself, right?
Yeah.
And you have to trust that there's no way to game what's actually being put in the blockchain. And there's also the fact that by assuming that everyone involved in the blockchain is untrustworthy, it certainly seems to be attracting a lot of untrustworthy people to that world. Won't go into, but basically like they're trying to game the system, right?
Right.
And because they're specifically trying to do this in an extra legal, super legal, like a non, they're not trying to rely on legal frameworks to build out enforcement. They're, basically it's encouraging that gaming because it's kind of the point of it that we need to be able to find all these loopholes and stuff that are in it
Well,
in order to do that.
but even the early internet, like people were doing nefarious stuff on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Like crazy stuff on but at some point it kind of was regulated and we learned how to use it in not such a horrible manner. And
But all of that came down to legal consequences.
yes, actually, that is true. But I guess like the thing with blockchain is I know like there's no such thing as a completely trustless system. Like if large number tries to game it, it will work. But I guess like the in concept, the idea of having such a system, I think maybe will help like provenance work better in a way. But again, like I guess that's what you're saying. It's such a blockchain is not a thing yet.
Right, yeah.
But there, the idea, I think, is
I would love to see it. But
help me out.
I'd love to be a spectator to such a thing. But yeah, I mean, I definitely, yeah, I appreciate the effort. I've been through that process with my own adjacent little thing that didn't involve nearly as much money, involved no money. But yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, when earlier you were talking about how neural networks, like artificial neural networks, tend to work in a way that's, you said, more continuous.
Yes.
I guess I'm wondering why that is. Is it because they like represent discrete ideas across multiple neurons? Or is it like,
Well, so this is one reason why I'm kind of waving my hands during a Wednesday night BS fest instead of writing a paper about it. But what it comes down to is that, let's talk about large language models for a second. So an input to a large language model is a token, which is an embedding. And it's an embedding that's represented in an embedding space that has however many floating point numbers. And if you nudge that floating point number by a certain amount, it's not going to make that much of a difference, but it will change.
sure,
And there's, like any change in that embedding space has a real but impossible to determine by just looking at it consequence on the meaning of that token.
okay,
And so once again, you have one token that represents one particular word. And it, you know, it has a set of numbers, and then you have another one that represents another word, and it has a different set of numbers. And if what you're doing is, you know, you have your embedding space of, you know, however many, we'll say 2 for now, and you have this guy here and this guy here. Let's say for now, those are all the tokens we have in the embedding space. Where along this gradient does it stop being this token and start being this token?
Okay.
And so at some point in a human brain, there's a transition. You know, there's still like, yeah, you can think multiple thoughts about a particular referent in the world, a particular object, and it can wander around. Your activation can wander around, but then when you think about something else, you're very obviously switching state to something else. There's
like a jump that's not continuous.
yes, exactly. There's a discontinuity in the activation space somehow. We don't know exactly what it is.
Sure.
And so that's my point, is that those discontinuities, whether they are, you know, whether it's a hard line or it's a, you know, kind of a fuzzy region, or it's something else entirely, you know, these could be like Gaussian clouds, and maybe, but the thing is then the ties back to the referent, it's like, how do you get that to work?
This is just basically purely based on the fact that it's a differentiable model?
Yes.
Okay,
So I blame it on backprop.
got it, okay.
I see. For the forward guys.
Oh, yeah, that's a cool one, yeah, I love that paper.
Huge hype or something.
Yeah.
Still recording? You can probably turn it off.
Actually, they might finish the paper.
Oh.
It's really good.